Hello, my name is Wildstag, and thank you for tuning in to another used book rant. Today, I'm going to be covering this book, Stalking the Big Bird. The subtitle is A Tale of Turkeys, Biologists, and Bureaucrats by Harley Shaw. The cover illustration is of a Merriam's Wild Turkey by Paul Bosman, courtesy of Paul Bosman. This is also the author of Soul Among Lions, which I have ranted about on this channel before, and I've got his book right behind me on the shelf. A couple things about this book. First of all, I bought it for $6.98 at Coas, and you can see that Coas sticker right here. If I ever had a camera good enough to zoom in on it, you would see Coas Books, and it says it was put on the shelves, I guess, May 8th, 2022. So I bought this book in October of 2022 alongside The Vagrant, On Trails, and Exploration of so on and so forth. I've read both of those books, and I ranted about one of them already. I also bought The Anthropology of Turquoise, and I'm currently working my way through that. It is a bit slow, and it is a bit it's not the most engaging. The parts about turquoise and the color blue are the most interesting, but it's one of those where it's interspersed with a personal story about the author, and I'm just not reading it for that. So parts of it are slow, parts of it are really engaging. And then I also bought the National Cowboy Poetry Gathering, the anthology, right up here, celebrating 30 years of wrangling words, by the Western Folklife Center. I'm working my way through that one as well. That one's a bit tougher just because it doesn't resonate with me personally. Some of it is very more ubiquitously Western, whereas some of it is very specific to cowboy poetry. I also really appreciate books that have people that wrote in it, highlighted it, different parts, and this one does kind of have that, but not in spades. The last one I discussed on this channel that had a lot of highlights was the one about immigration and deportation. So this one kind of gets close with that, but wasn't as highlighted. It is also autographed signed by the author in a message on the cover page that says, "To Lloyd and Matilda, enjoy a bit of macrobiology, Harley G. Shaw." And on the page right inside the cover, here in it says M. Hosworth, 2004. Well, this book came out in 2004, so they must have bought it. I don't know if it was at a book signing or if they bought it and then brought it to a book signing. Either way, they got a personal message from Harley G. Shaw, which is also just really cool. I like when I get to find things like that in books. The preface really describes what this book is about in a great way, and I'm going to read it right now, at least the first paragraph of it. The core subject of this book is the Merriam's wild turkey, the subspecies of turkey native to the southern Rocky Mountains and the Colorado Plateau. However, the book's purpose is not necessarily to teach turkey biology, but rather to demonstrate the difficulties of gaining and implementing new knowledge of a single wild species or a single subspecies, as is the case here. I think anyone confused over the complexities of modern wildlife conservation might find this book of interest. Since the publication of Aldo Leopold's Game Management in 1933, along with the passage of the Pittman-Robertson Act in 1937, state and federal wildlife agencies have functioned under the belief that increased knowledge produced by research would improve our ability to manage wildlife. We must hope that this is true, but the information that follows herein suggests that the more we know about a species and the system within which it lives, the more difficult clear decisions may become. In fact, ignorance and decisiveness can be very compatible bedmates. I have become concerned that humans lack the wisdom needed to manage wildlife, even if all we have to do is apply biological fact. Given the complexities created by multiple human desires, the management of wildlife begins to look hopeless. what people want is rarely, perhaps never, derived from any understanding of ecology. In fact, more often than not, we develop myths that sound like science to justify our wants. If we add one another complicating element, the fact that management to favor one desired wildlife species is likely to be antagonistic to the needs of other, often also desired species, rational wildlife management begins to look impossible. That's really interesting to me because it discusses the mindset of the author in a very succinct and clear written way, which is the more we know about a creature, the less we really know about it. And as much as we can try to understand wildlife, we have to look at a giant web of how all these different species interact. All of these different factors go into understanding an animal. Stalking the Big Bird really discusses a lot of those complications that goes into the job. So he says in the first chapter that the proposed study reflected the Arizona Game and Fish Department's desire to eliminate the lottery system for allocating permits, allowing anyone to buy a turkey tag and hunt during the 2-week season. At the time, a move was afoot to simplify regulations. If they had no obvious biological purpose, eliminating the expense and inconvenience of drawings made sense. The need for such restricted hunting has been challenged by studies of Gambel's quail in southern Arizona that had demonstrated that fall hunting had virtually no effect on quail populations. And then underneath that is the next line: turkeys, like quail, produce large broods during summer and often experience relatively high natural losses during winter. And then whoever was reading this underlined the relatively high natural losses during winter and said in the margins, do they die of starvation? And then on the following page, there's a sentence that says, I hadn't considered extra demands on law enforcement personnel, nor had I recognized that each of these units was the preferred hunting ground of a particular community or group of hunters. These hunters would raise holy hell if their favorite hunting areas were closed. Hence, the agency that had assigned the study now turned down the design I felt was needed to accomplish it. And right next to these hunters would raise holy hell, there's a line in the margins that says, so what? With an exclamation mark, indicating pretty clearly what the attitude of the previous owner felt about this. And there's a couple other underlinings throughout this. The first few chapters are about the effort that Harley Shaw had to go through to get the study started, and then also a chapter about the object of our obsession, where he describes in depth the Merriam's wild turkey and discusses how they almost went extinct at one point. Turkeys as a whole almost went extinct in the US, that they still existed south of the border, but in the US we had almost driven them to extinction, and now their ubiquity around the country is due to efforts to reintroduce them to areas and for them to repopulate the country. So, like, I grew up in Maryland, and I remember one day on the way to school, on the school bus, we had to stop to let a whole flock of turkeys cross the road. Those turkeys had been eliminated in Maryland back in the 1800s and were reintroduced through a lot of conservation efforts to get them to spread across the entire country again. So the population in Maryland is able to thrive and survive because of the efforts to save turkey subspecies in the West, such as Merriam's wild turkey. He also discusses how it got its scientific name, and in a very similar manner to what Gary Paul Nabin described in his book about his pilgrimage to Italy, that a lot of people thought in the part of Italy he was, that corn came from Turkey, and that other aspects, it came through the trade networks. It had to have come from Far East through Turkey first. So it describes how turkeys, had that same effect, that people thought they were from Turkey rather than from the Americas. There's that, and then there's some other interesting aspects to the chapters. There's a really funny aside in this book where Shaw discusses a hunt where he and another worker for the Arizona Fish and Game Department are doing the inspections of tags, people that had gone through the area looking for turkey. So in this case, he is operating as a turkey ranger, and he's asked by a older gentleman on a motorbike, "Oh, what's the best plot for finding turkeys?" And he goes out there, and about 2 hours later he comes back and says, I didn't see any sign of turkeys out there. What's another good plot?" And so this guy is going between parcels of land looking for turkey, and eventually, I don't remember in the book if it says he got it or not, but this older gentleman eventually does kind of relax and hang out with the two rangers and just start talking to them and chit-chatting. And this group of very clearly inebriated 4 hunters are driving off, and they start complaining about, "Oh, all of your regulations have ruined the hunt," and they're making all these different complaints, how all of the problems are because of the 2 rangers that are stationed there. And obviously that's not true, but when inebriated and frustrated, it's easy to vent that frustration at the target in front of you. And so these 2 rangers kind of have to just take it because they're public servants and they can't stand up for themselves in certain ways. And instead, this older gentleman gets up, starts chewing these guys out and just yelling at them for about 10 minutes. Eventually they get the message, they drive off, and the older gentleman says that he did a full career in the Nevada so this guy did a whole 30-year career in the Nevada Fish and Game Department, and he always wanted to just chew out anyone that gave him that kind of tone, but he couldn't because he was a public servant. And as a retiree, he wanted to help out these 2 rangers in that way. And this guy is a big 6-foot something older gentleman, so he gives them a talking to, and they get the message and leave. And that's a really funny story that happens in Stalking the Big Bird. There's some really interesting stuff in here as well about all the different attempts to track turkeys, multiple chapters on it, and different attempts to catch them with like net guns and creating like net gun traps and all these different methods of how they're going to catch these turkeys and track them and study them. But there's just a lot of really interesting information, like how efforts for radio callers and radio trackers in wildlife comes from trying to track the turkey population in the 70s and seeing how big these radio trackers end up being, and it's too big for turkeys, but through various efforts they are able to make it smaller. And one person who works for Arizona ends up being able to, because he's doing so many radio callers, he is effectively able to split from Arizona's state government and work as a business making these radio tags and collars and receivers and everything, so that way he can help other wildlife agencies. Another thing he discusses, which is really fascinating, is the paleobiology of turkeys. And in this case, it turns out that turkeys kind of disappeared from the evolutionary record in the Colorado Plateau area up until about 2,500 years ago. That there's no fossils from the about 10,000 year to 2,500 year old range. For 7,500 years, they can find nothing. So there's a belief in some of these communities he's discussing that turkeys were imported by the Anasazi, or rather the ancestral Puebloans, as they are more appropriately called, that the ancestral Puebloans imported turkeys to the area, and then turkeys were able to spread from there. It may also just have something to do with the environment and how fossils form, or how they're able to find records of these animals. But he discusses pretty closely how it seems that turkeys weren't in the area more than 2,500 years ago, and then all of a sudden, with human habitation and domestication and agriculture, it expands in the area. So it's a really cool book. It has a lot of interesting information, a lot of interesting blurbs. So yeah, altogether, this is just a really interesting book about wildlife management. It's short. It's only, let's see, about 135 pages of content. So you can pick it up, read it pretty easily, put it down. The different chapters flow but are very independent as well. So you can pick it up and read it slowly. You can go through it pretty quickly as well. It's a fun book, and I really love it. This is one of those kind of wildlife management and wildlife story books that I really like. Usually it's about predators, bears, mountain lions, wolves, that kind of thing. But sometimes it's about deer, elephants, baboons, and in this case, turkey. And I would recommend it to anyone that reads this kind of book, those wildlife studies kinds of books. So, yeah. My name is Wildstag, and thank you for tuning in to another used book rant.